I'm not sure if anybody in this room will recognise that steamer, but its significance for this presentation is that in 1954, the management of the Campbell Company in the Bristol Channel made a big thing out of it being the centenary year of when Campbell's started, not in the Bristol Channel, but in 1854 on the Clyde. And that's, from a slightly different collection, that's the best picture I could find of an original Campbell steamer, albeit on the Clyde, to denote that year. The 6 main paddle steamers that these pictures include are, firstly, in the first half, the 4 that were the survivors of the post-war era, and then after the Second World War there had been 4 or 5 ships lost, and B&A Campbell built 2 brand new paddle steamers. So we'll go through them all in sequence. That's the oldest of the survivors. The Ravenswood was built in 1891 as a Bristol Channel ship. It didn't look like that at all when it was new, but it was built at the air yard of McKnight's, and bizarrely enough, well, I looked up a trade magazine from the day, the Marine Engineer, which you can find in specialist libraries, and it was cheerfully described when it was brand new as being stronger than the Waverley, and that's the Campbell 1885 Waverley, but it's a very pertinent remark, and it took me years to sort of really get to the bottom of exactly what was meant in the technical press by that. But the first Waverley that came to the Bristol Channel in 1887, it would be wrong to say it was a failure, but it wasn't strong enough for the conditions it experienced. And you would think, why not? It was a perfectly sound, good Clyde steamer, but after a very short time, it had a small fortune spent on it to strengthen it and rebuild it and make it far more weatherproof for the weather conditions it faced. And so when the Ravenswood was specified for Bristol Channel duties, it was specified with, and I quote, heavier scantlings. And that's what was said in 1891 when it was brand new. Most of these old black and white negatives, which have all been scanned, are quite good. That one's not quite so good, but what is fairly apparent, she was massively rebuilt after the Second World War and acquired concealed paddle boxes. There aren't many pictures in this collection of her. After the centenary year in 1954, she was put aside and never sailed again and went to the breakers. Some of you may recognise this if you've been to Bristol. That's at a dock that is almost, its location is still recognisable, but that's in the heart of Bristol. And that's on the River Usk at Newport in South Wales, and that's the Ravenswood on the way to the breakers. The next ship, which conveniently for this presentation was the next in age that survived the war, was the 1896 Britannia. Again, she didn't look like that when she was new. She had, from memory, 3 substantive major rebuilds, but she lasted after the Second World War, when she'd been reboilered, until 1956. She had a very good reputation for reliability. There she is at Minehead, which picture was taken shortly after the little harbour at Minehead was reopened in 1951. I'm afraid that picture's not so good, but I had to include it, Seagull as well, partly because that's one of the furthest flung destinations of the Bristol Channel down at Clovelly in North Devon. That's in Bristol. She still had another year or 2 to run, but her time was running out for her even by then. The company's finances were going down the pan. Oops, sorry. Again, I apologise for that one not being quite so sharp, but it does show the general majesty of traditional paddle boxes. I'm sure anybody that has been to the Bristol Channel and been to Lundy will recognise that location. In recent years, the new pier has been built, which sort of comes out there. But right up until when I first started going there in the 70s, the normal practice was to anchor, maybe at that sort of distance, and then there might be 2 or 3 small boats taking people ashore. That one, and I was very fortunate archiving all these slides for the PSPS. The chap that took them, a photographer, an enthusiast called Norman Bird, they were all in individually, nearly all of them were in individually dated sleeves. And the fact that there's very precise dates on them was extraordinarily useful. So although that was her farewell cruise and billed as such and carried out as such, she did actually last for a day or two beyond that. Again, I think the location is easily recognisable, but the pier has been completely rebuilt at Ilfracombe since then. We thought it best not to shy away from the sort of sad, miserable photographs in this collection. That's Britannia on her. I'm trying to remember where she did go to the breakers. I can't remember if she went to Belgium or somewhere. I should know that, but that's her at the end of her reign. She was then, I think the company might consciously have kept her to just make it for her 60th anniversary. So 1956. And there she is on the same sort of occasion, roughly. We're moving over to we're still in the Bristol Channel. I don't know if anybody will recognise that. I particularly like this photograph myself because it's the best one in this particular collection that shows what was the main, if not the only, railway connected pier in the Bristol Channel at Barry. And it had the great advantage, and would be a huge advantage nowadays if it was still there, of being accessible at any state of the tide, whereas nearly everywhere else isn't. So just behind that wall at the top, there was a railway platform, and there were at one point 4 tracks there and two other platform, another platform, 2 together, and a boat train would come down from Cardiff, park at the top there, and a few hundred people would board the steamer at any state of the tide. So Glen Usk was built, again, Clyde steamer. She was launched at the Ailsa Yard at Troon on Saturday the 11th of April 1914. She was 231 foot long, and she was in effect the third of 3 similar ships, the other 2 having been Lady Ismay in 1911, followed by Glenavon. They were effectively an identical trio. Beautiful looking ships. A huge capacity as well. Somewhere I wrote down the carrying capacity, but I think on a Class 5 certificate, a ship like that could take over 1,700 passengers in very shallow waters like the Avon. Obviously, the equivalent here would be the upper reaches of the Clyde, I guess. The Glen Usk lasted a good few years longer than both the Ravenswood and the Britannia. I'm not sure where that is. There was no clue, but it's fairly near the beginning of the season. She remained a coal burner to the end, although it was always said that she was lined up to be converted to oil burning, but it never took place. Again, I would have struggled to identify the location of that, but the envelope that it was in did say Minehead, and that's looking up the Bristol Channel with the Avon and Bristol on the right-hand side and South Wales out of sight on the left. That shot just has to be included, really, because it shows where the Campbell ships all laid up in the centre of Bristol every winter in a location that it's recognisable now because you can see the spire of, in the very far distance, the church, the big church at St Mary Redcliffe, but that's on the north side of the floating harbour at Bristol. But before the First World War, Campbell's would have their entire fleet, which at one point got to, depending on how you count, 12, 13 or 14 ships. They would all lay up in Bristol for 3, 4, 5 months in and around that area. And if you've been to Bristol, roughly speaking, that's opposite where the SS Great Britain is, on the other side of the floating harbour. That one's a bit wonky. That's the Glen Usk leaving Weston-super-Mare. For those that are interested in piers as well, Weston-super-Mare Burnbeck Pier has long been derelict, but work has, I think, actually now started on its renovation, partly because in the long term they hope to resurrect a lifeboat station, which is part of the pier structure as well. But that's our NLI money rather than anybody else's. Again, a lovely picture of the harbour at Barry. I don't know if you can quite make out, the previous picture of the Glen Usk was alongside the harbour wall there. Barry Harbour still looks rather like that, with a few houses up on the top. There was a Butlins holiday camp in the 60s over to the left, which is now completely gone. But the main entrance to the Barry Docks complex was through that lock into numbers 1 and 2 docks, which are right round. There was a huge area that was enclosed at Barry. Again, that is a site I barely can identify now. The place is there at Cardiff Bay. That is the old Cardiff Pier Head terminus berth. There were 2 berths each which could take 2 vessels at the foot of Bute Street in Cardiff. All of those buildings in the background have gone now. But bizarrely, if you do go there, 1 or 2 tiny bits of the pontoon structures, the floating pontoons have long gone, but the structures that the ramps were attached to, parts of them are still there, and one has even still got an old semaphore signal on it. Very bizarre. But in the 90s, the whole area was enclosed and has become, I think lagoon is probably the wrong word, but the whole area is now kept at a constant level of water. There are trip boats there, but it was the place where the White Funnel Fleet drew most of its passengers from. And that is the same ship again, a couple of years on, coming up from the outer sea. Penarth Head is back round the corner. She's about to swing right round and do a 90-degree turn onto one of the berths. There she is again. But that picture's actually been seen in 1 or 2 books. It just conveys the sort of rather peaceful sort of atmosphere on a quiet day of calm. I just think a white funnel of that height is just almost preposterous, really. It's absolutely bloody superb. But the Glen Usk, right up until the end of her career, was mainly associated with going backwards and forwards across the Bristol Channel from Cardiff and Penarth across to Weston-super-Mare. Most days she might do 2 trips or 3 trips in the morning, and then depending on the tide would have to withdraw because there was no water, and then come back as the tide rose in the afternoon and do 2, 3 or possibly 4 round trips in the evening to take everybody back to Cardiff from Weston. Sadly, there were hardly any pictures in this collection, and I would love there to have been more, but that is the only one, basically, of the engine room alleyways and the back of one of the engineers on the control platform of the Glen Usk. So 1959, she lasted another year or two after that. It was converted since she was built, and that had been the restaurant once upon a time, but it ended up, so some of the old regulars have told me, as a sort of glorified snack bar or even just a bar, but it had long since ceased to have its original function. And there she is again. Exquisitely beautiful lines, I'd say, but very much, you'll forgive me for saying it, very much a Clyde steamer, looking rather good. We move on a bit now to the fourth of the pre-war survivors post-war. Glen Gower was the only Campbell steamer built between the wars, new for the company. She also came from Ailsa's at Troon. Forgive me if some of you know all of this, given that it's very much Clyde steamer history as well, but she was actually ordered in 1920, and it was some kind of record for Campbell's, but she didn't enter service till 1922. The Ailsa yard. I've actually seen some of the correspondence, the complaints from Campbell's about the delay, but fundamentally, it sounds familiar. Ailsa took the contract in 1920. There was a very strange arrangement in the contract whereby the ship always was going to have second-hand engines taken out of a pre-First World War steamer that had survived the First World War and were thought to be good enough. She had the Albion's engines, if I remember rightly. So she was always going to be an oddity with second-hand engines, but the steel shortages meant that when did she finally arrive? That's right, she left Troon on the 26th of May at 5:10 in the morning, so it said in the press at the time, and she got to Bristol at 7 o'clock on Friday the following day. And she had a reasonable turn of speed and I've never, to my great frustration, been able to find an account of her trials, but it was said that she was good for 21 miles an hour, which is, 18 and a half, 19 knots or thereabouts. Again, that profile of a very sharply angled bow. Right, I'm struggling to remember. I should have written down where some of these were. If I remember rightly, that's on the south coast. Glen Gower went to run out of Brighton and Eastbourne for 3 years, 1954, 55, 56, before Campbell's gave up down there. And Glen Gower was the main ship. She had the merit of being able to cross the English Channel on her certificate. There she is again. Again, I apologise. I'm not 100% sure I can identify where that one is, but that, though, is at Newhaven when she was on the south coast, and Newhaven, which is still functioning today as a continental ferry port in a manner of speaking, the railway boats and the railway tracks were on the left-hand side of the picture, and you can just see one of the Dieppe steamers there. And there were a couple of berths on the west side of the harbour at Newhaven where the Campbell ships could lie overnight and be bunkered and take stores and everything. And that's her, again, it's not specifically named, but that might well be Brighton. Either of the piers at Brighton, I'm not sure I can exactly identify it, but they were both still functioning in 1955. That's a bit easier to identify. When Waverley goes to Ilfracombe, it's still a great pleasure to walk right round the harbour to that very same place to take a photograph. Lundy is not in sight on that picture, but it's 12 or 13 miles down to the west on the left-hand side. A very handsome-looking ship, I think. She didn't undergo a great deal of modification, so she lasted till the late 50s. But she was big. She was, trying to remember, she was something like, I think she was slightly longer than Waverley. I think she was 240 odd foot. Again, that's the only picture in the collection that it's not very good, but it's all there was of her engine room. This is where it gets a bit more sad. That's, I believe, the scene at Cardiff docks. The date is, I'm perfectly happy with, 1960, but the three ships that you can see fully there, with the bow of the fourth, are the entire fleet as it was then, with the two modern Queens laid up for the winter there, but also the Glen Gower. She lingered for a year or two before she went off to the breakers. That, I'm pretty certain, was the tug that came to collect her to take her for the final voyage for scrapping. This location is not Cardiff. This is, I'm pretty certain, this is Penarth Dock, with Penarth Head up on the left, for a subtle difference to those of us from that part of the world. And I suspect, but I'm not sure, that the photographer scooted round to Penarth Pier to take that picture from Penarth Dock. It's doable, and they would have just had time to whiz round to get that picture. And that's the end of the first part, Eric. If I can just, I think we're okay on time. The second half is similar sort of length. Oh, there we go. Yeah. So it just, it's not on the. Oh, there we go.
Right. Okay.
I think we're back in business.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, leave it on that one for a minute. Yep. Okay, I think I'll just get through this lot. I cheekily call this Recycle for the Clyde River Steamer Club, because that's what this presentation is. But part two is the two more modern post-war steamers, the Cardiff Queen and the Bristol Queen. The Bristol Queen is the slightly older one, and of all the 6 ships I'm talking about this evening, she is the odd one out, in that she was built in Bristol. The other 5 are all Clyde steamers, Clyde-built steamers. The Bristol Queen was, people, to this day that remember both of the Queens argue about which was the better of the two. I would be quite happy to have had a voyage on either of them, quite honestly, but the Bristol Queen was big, powerful, pretty dependable, slogged up and down day after day. For many years when she was new, her basic routine was to go from Bristol, calling at 4 or 5 piers, to Ilfracombe almost every day. She would go a bit later each day on the tidal cycle. So within 5 or 6 days, she might leave Bristol at 8 o'clock, 8:30, 9 o'clock, 9:15, 10 o'clock. And then as the morning tides ran out, she would then have a day or two of not going to Ilfracombe, perhaps go up the Severn Estuary instead towards Sharpness. And then as the tidal cycle moved round, she would then revert to going back down on her normal run to Ilfracombe with the tide rather than against it. Yeah. So that's 1951 when she was new. An awful lot of people didn't like her treatment of the aft lifeboats. They were sort of never ideal, really. That was after they'd been moved slightly out of the way from where they'd been put when she was built. But still a pretty elegant looking ship. That's down at Ilfracombe. There's no mistaking that view. Again, it was, I don't know about no-brainer, but I don't think any thought was given to traditional paddle boxes after the war. But she wasn't really a copy of anything. She was built by shipbuilders Charles Hill in Bristol, and they were unable to take an order for a second ship, so Campbell's had to go elsewhere for the Cardiff Queen, but that's the one-off that Bristol Queen was. Again, that's like the opening shot of the Balmoral. The ship has just come up the river at Bristol at low water, and what she will almost certainly do is come straight past the berth, swing round on a rising tide by the Cumberland Basin, and then drop back down the river and exchange her passengers there, and then leave again on the slightly higher tide at that point. They used to manage trips from Bristol down the river and back on the top of the tide, squeezed in before going back down channel. It's some of the journeys they got up to in the early days are just legendary. A ship might be out at, if it was high water at 4 a.m, then 4 a.m was when they would go from Bristol to Ilfracombe, drop people there at breakfast time. They'd give Ilfracombe people a day in Bristol, and then go back, and then perhaps be back at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning on the second day. It didn't happen very often, but if that kind of tide coincided with a bank holiday Monday, then that was where the money was, and they did. It's almost incredible. You just cannot imagine Waverley doing that kind of insane scheduling now. But that's what they did, certainly before the First World War, double Ilfracombes if the tides necessitated it, to make enough money to keep them going through the winter. That will be a similar occasion where the shippers, I don't know if anybody will recognise that location, but one of those big tobacco warehouses is still standing to this day in the centre of Bristol. It's actually the Bristol City Record Office now, which conveniently is where the records of P&A Campbell, which all survive, which is where they're held. So she has just swung. I can't remember when it stopped now, but in the 90s, the greatest spectacle for us local enthusiasts was watching Waverley do that very same manoeuvre. Unbelievably skilled, quite often in the dark. Very, very fine judgment. There's hardly any room to spare. Absolutely marvellous. That's sort of what it still can be like. Going down, that's just off the North Devon coast. That's the ship returning in the evening with having left Ilfracombe behind. I'm afraid I can't identify the vessel on the right. It was quite normal every 2 weeks, I think, for a Trinity houseboat to go out to Lundy, and they would take the stores for the lighthouses when they were all manned and swap the lighthouse keepers over as well between their turns of duty. but it was quite normal still in the 50s for Campbell's to keep not only 2 or 3 launches out at Lundy, but they would have a boatman out there, and they had accommodation on the island for people to stay during the season to man their own small boats. I don't know if anybody will recognise that picture. It went in the book we did for the PSPS fundraising, but it's very famous locally in Cardiff. Anybody, any guesses? Shirley Bassett, yeah. Literally, when she was starting her career, the enterprising Mr. Smith Cox that ran P&A Campbell did a deal. He had interest in a hotel company and with entertainers, and there would be a jazz band or various other entertainment, fashion shows on board the paddlers, all sorts of things. But that's a pretty epic picture, I think. So worth drawing your attention to. That's Cardiff again, the pier head. Yeah, again, this one wasn't located, but I believe that's probably down at Avonmouth, which is the port outside Bristol. But you get a pretty good idea of how much work there had to be undertaken to keep her in good shape. Although the money was less and less as the years went by, and after 1956, the company was in severe financial trouble, and they closed down their workshops and everything in Bristol and subcontracted everything out after 1956, and that's the start of that era. It is always said, and I do believe this, having talked to people that go back to then, that the standards of maintenance went right down once they lost their own facility or had to give it up. So, but at this point, Bristol Queen is just a youngster, sort of 10 years old or thereabouts, and very popular, and doing that Ilfracombe run most days when she could. Did have an occasional prang. I don't know the details of that one, but as you can imagine, it was one of the easier ones to patch up that compared to some of the scrapes they got into. I believe that's when they were laid up in Cardiff docks to save money in the winter. A slightly nicer scene. That's probably the very start of the season in 1958. And that picture is, unbelievably, that's actually taken from very near the Cardiff pier head. So what you're looking at there is the ship has just left Penarth on the right-hand side, and the Bristol Channel goes right round in a 90-degree bend at that point, past Lavernock Point. Obviously, lots of people have photographed the steamers from the Clifton Suspension Bridge over the years. The gorge was interesting. It did have a railway down both sides of it at one point, but the one that you see there is the one that's still open for freight to Portishead on the left. Again, I wish I knew, but I can't be 100% certain of the location of that. I suspect it's near Portishead, near a place called Battery Point, where if a ship's coming back to Bristol from down Channel, Portishead and Battery Point is where it would turn into the tidal River Avon. That's straightforward enough. That's Ilfracombe. There's a couple of pictures now which are slightly different. Bristol Queen had to have major repairs to her paddle wheels, and she was sent round to the Cousins Yard at Weymouth in Dorset, and she went round in the autumn, sort of October time, and I think she was there for 3 or 4 months. Some of you may know the name of Richard Clammer, a very good friend of mine who's I think of him as the expert on cousins, along with John as well. And Richard remembers scenes like that when he was a schoolboy, and suffice it to say, Bristol Queen was probably twice as big as any of the local cousin steamers, so it looked enormously impressive, tied up in Weymouth. Right. Yeah, now I perhaps wouldn't have been able to recognise this myself, but Campbell's very enterprisingly laid on some long weekend trips from the Bristol Channel with Bristol Queen in 1963, which involved taking people down one day from Bristol and Cardiff and then putting them in hotels in Penzance for either 1 or 2 or I think on one occasion 3 nights, and then the ship would lie in the harbour at Penzance and then cross to the Isles of Scilly. And it must have been an absolutely fascinating weekend. It's a very, very, very long way. I'm guessing, but it would be probably like, I don't know, Waverley going to Dublin or something for a weekend, but much further than the mouth of the Clyde. The Isles of Scilly are nowhere near the Bristol Channel. They're out into the Atlantic, twice or 3 times the distance of Lundy. I'm sure some of you will recognise the steamer, the local ship on the left. That's the 1956, the second Silonian, which in later life did become a Campbell ship briefly, not very successfully, but that's the Silonian 2, which then was quite a youngster. I think she was built in 1956. There she is again. I'm not sure that Campbell's actually made money on this trip. All the old anecdotal stuff says that it was a charter that the charterer backed out of, and Campbell's ran the trip themselves, despite there being less than 200 people. Obviously, I think like all of them are there in that picture, but the economics of running a paddle steamer to the Isles of Scilly with less than 200 don't bear thinking about, really. But there's the evidence. That's Lundy, and I do remember a scene like that because that landing stage arrangement was what was in use right through until around about 1999 when the new pier was built that the Oldenburg uses. That's back in the centre of Bristol, and that's the last of the 6 ships which I'm talking about. The Cardiff Queen was, and I'm sure most of you will know this better than I, it was a copy of, a more or less straight copy of the Clyde pair, the Jupiter and the Juno, with concealed paddle boxes, for the simple reason Campbell's couldn't get anything else to their specific requirements built in time post-war, so Hills couldn't oblige with more than 1 ship at Bristol, so they went to Fairfields, and the design, I think the basis of the contract was more or less a straight copy of the Clyde pair, but without any real variations which would have needed drawings and taken longer time. Opinion is very divided about which was the better of the 2 post-war ships. I can only refer you to Nick James, who wrote the definitive book on Cardiff Queen, and Nick, a bit older than me, but he remembered in his childhood in Bristol travelling. I think he was only 7 or 8 years old when he was let loose on the paddle steamers by his parents, but he got to know the chief engineers of both, and I think the consensus was that the Clyde built ship was actually the better of the 2. More reliable, a slightly better turn of speed, And so if they were both wonderful, that was the slightly more wonderful, I think, was how enthusiasts remember them. But she was launched. And again, I've been unable to find much in the press about that. She didn't get much coverage, I don't think, when she was launched, but she came out in February 1947, and she could manage 18 and a quarter knots. So very much a close match to Bristol Queen. I mentioned earlier that Glen Gower, the older ship, spent a period on the south coast for 3 years. Before she did that, Cardiff Queen was sent round for 2 seasons to Brighton, 1952 and 1953. And so she is seen there, I am pretty certain, at Newhaven in Sussex. That's a bit closer to the present day. I was saying to somebody a little earlier on that I had the pleasure of being on Waverley's Eastbourne trip earlier this year, and Eastbourne Pier does actually look rather like that. Probably a bit flashier, actually, but it was something verging on unbelievable to actually see Eastbourne Pier used again with a proper ship against it. So I can only hope personally that will be repeated, but it was one hell of a feat for Waverley. Although you can't see it, Brighton West Pier was perhaps where they picked up most passengers in that post-war period. But at that point, they weren't trying to run cross-channel trips. They were mainly doing fairly short trips along the south coast, around Beachy Head, or quite often the Cardiff Queen would go to one of the 3 or 4 Isle of Wight piers, which would be a nice length trip, but not very interesting coastline for the day. The going west from Brighton is a far more attractive run round to Eastbourne and Hastings. There she is again. At the risk of stating the obvious, that's her going astern out of Western. It does look like she's making an awful effort. Western still would be one of those very difficult places where the tide surges round the pier at a very awkward angle, and it was perfectly normal back in the 70s when Balmoral was running as a commercial ship for her to have to take 3 or 4 attempts to be able to come alongside the pier at Birnbeck. The swell would mean that it was just almost impossibly difficult to berth her. That was a very unusual trip to Milford Haven in West Wales. I think it was in connection with an oil refinery opening. It was not a charter, but it was certainly a special occasion, as you can see from she's dressed. That is a nice angle of Ilfracombe in North Devon. Again, Cardiff Queen did roughly the same as Bristol Queen, but would tend to go from the Welsh side of the channel in the summer. If there was enough demand on days when the tide was good, one big ship would start at Cardiff, and the other would start at Bristol. When times were quieter, a Bristol ship might call in at Cardiff and then take longer, but that was the sort of more normal pattern of operation. I suspect it's not labelled, but that's off Lundy. That's again, that's probably the last year they stayed in Bristol for wintering. That's in the upper part of the Bristol Channel. That I can be quite sure about. Waverley does still go to Porthcawl in South Wales. Can be awkward, but there are times when the seas smash right over the breakwater at Porthcawl. But on a nice day, Porthcawl is a great delight to sail into. Lundy again, that's what's called Rat Island on the left there. low tide. And that's Clovelly in North Devon, where Campbell's didn't keep their own boats down there. When one of the paddle steamers went to Clovelly, there was a willing number of fishermen who would come out and row people to and from the ship, and I think it was all included in the fare by then, but back in the day you might have had to pay the boatman an extra fee to go ashore, sixpence or whatever. Right, we're moving on a bit now in time. I'm conscious I'm running out of time slightly, but that's Barry Pier again, but with the first small motor ship that Campbell's acquired to supplement their fleet, the Centrello. I'm not going to attempt to pronounce it in Welsh, but the correct Welsh pronunciation of Centrello is Centrello, I believe. It's sort of in North Walian dialect. That's the last year the two ran together, the two big paddle steamers. The Cardiff Queen was the first to go, if I remember right. No, sorry, I'm improvising. I can't remember which. They went within a year of each other, but that one was out of sequence. But it was just a nice one to show the two together. Conversely, there were occasions when, unusually, both would be lying adjacent to one another down at Ilfracombe. Am I okay till 8 o'clock or thereabouts? Yeah, there's just a handful of pictures now which are, there was a sort of quartet of motor ships that followed the paddle steamers into the 70s. Most people would never have heard of that one. That was a ship that was just chartered for 1 year down at Brighton and Eastbourne in 1957. It came from the Thames. It was a general steam navigation vessel that was surplus in 1957, and Campbell's took the risk of chartering it after they'd withdrawn the big paddle steamer down there. But it's a fairly sharp picture, so I thought that was worth including. Then there's a couple now, the St. Trithlow. From memory, I haven't got a note of it, but she was Clyde built at Fairfield and was built for service in North Wales. Her normal run was from Llandudno to the Menai Straits and vice versa. She didn't very often go all the way up to Liverpool, but she was fairly basic and not very fast. But a typical trip on her might only be an hour or an hour and a half. She didn't have a restaurant. She just had a little tiny tea bar. But she was quite an impressive looking little ship in her way. But I only encountered her for a first and only occasion when I moved to South Wales, and I was wandering around the docks at Barry when they were open to the public, and she was lying in the graving dock near the dock offices in Barry, and just a week or two later she was towed away to the breakers from memory, she went to Dublin to be broken. So I missed out on that one. But there she is. Again, that's coming into Barry, as is that. But they're really rather beautiful pictures, these. It would have been an absolute tragedy if these had been lost for all time. And that's a fairly rare occasion when she made it over to Minehead. So Campbell's originally, it is said, had a plan to run her in the shoulder season because she was cheaper than getting one of the paddlers out early in the year or keeping them on late in the year. So rather smaller than Balmoral, but and rather more basic. But and then we come to, this is a very unusual picture because it's as you can see, it's October 1965. It's right at the very end of the 1965 season, and she had been a red funnel steamer at Southampton on the run from Southampton to Cowes. I don't know if you can tell, but she, unlike Balmoral, she had her car deck forward. So the open windows on the main deck forward represented a space for about 10 or 12 cars. And Campbell's took her in 1965 with some speed and didn't repaint her that year. She was put into service immediately, and she kept her old name of Vector, her traditional Isle of Wight name. And there she is. That's at Cardiff. Slightly different angle, but the pontoon structures are a sort of giveaway at the pier head. And then a year later, she had the full P&A Campbell white funnel treatment, and that's how she looked then. And was renamed Westward Ho. Historically, Westward Ho was the first major P&A Campbell big steamer after the Ravenswood in 1894. So it was quite a nice idea to revive the name. And there she is again. She wasn't identical to Balmoral, but she was not even from the same drawings, I don't believe, but she was similar in concept and similar length, but quite a few detail differences. And I don't know if you can use your imagination on that shot. She probably is rolling horrifically as she comes into Ilfracombe there. And I can just imagine that she will be going from side to side and giving crew some qualms about getting her alongside safely. It's awkward, Ilfracombe, it really is. That's probably out at Lundy, and that's very nearly when she was at the end of her life. And then, pretty much finally, there was this one picture in the collection of both of the motor ships together at the pier head at Cardiff. So Westward Ho, the other side of the pontoon, very, very near the end of her life. Westward Ho came to a very sad end. One of her engines exploded would be a strong word, but a cylinder blew completely. I've talked to people that were on it, and it was sufficiently serious for her to be withdrawn there and then, and she never ran again. She just almost went straight to, not to scrap immediately. She spent years as a floating pub in Manchester, but that 1971 was when Westward Ho expired. And then, I think this is the final one in the collection, to sort of close with, if you like. That's Balmoral, and in that angle you can see exactly what she looked like in her original form when Waverley Excursions took her for 1986. As most will know, the car deck was built, the aft car deck was built upon and became the restaurant with a rather huge promenade deck above it. I'm one of those people that thinks she probably even looks even better after that rebuild, but the rebuild was done at Govan, if I remember rightly. And that's it, I'm afraid. Any questions?